Hey guys, tonight we drift off to a Hawaiian shore, where the ocean breeze ruffles your hair, and the sound of gentle waves lulls your mind into a state of tranquility. A spread of brilliant stars glitters above you, almost close enough to scoop out of the sky. You can practically feel the velvety night air wrapping itself around your shoulders. But don't be fooled by the gentle lull of the waves. If you tried to sail these waters without knowing their rhythms, you probably wouldn't survive this. Ancient Polynesians certainly understood the stakes. They studied everything, even the tiniest creatures, to navigate and mark the passage of time. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And feel free to comment your city and what time you're tuning in. Let's see who's the most dedicated night owl or early bird around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You hear the soft crunch of the sand underfoot as you step along a moonlit beach. The water's edge sparkles in the starlight, and if you stoop down to look closely, you notice a cluster of small, spiraled shells scattered across the shoreline. At first glance, they look unremarkable, like any other sea snail shells you'd find on a casual beach walk. But for the ancient Hawaiians, these shells weren't mere decorations. They were tiny beacons of knowledge, potential clues for when to plant, when to harvest, and even when to set sail. You kneel to inspect one. The halls are intricate, each curl reflecting the moon's glow. The snail inside once crawled along the reefs, feeding on algae and retreating into the safety of its shell during storms. If you pinch the shell gently and hold it to your ear, well, you won't hear the ocean's roar like a conch horn, but you might feel the hush of centuries of tradition swirling within. Imagine a time before smartphones or even compasses. You'd rely on the shifting tides, the shape of the clouds, and these unsuspecting little creatures to guide you through an archipelago that seemed boundless and mystical. Legends say that long before tall, masted ships appeared on the horizon, Polynesian voyagers arrived here by canoe, guided by the constellations and the behavior of marine life. A mainstream historical fact is that ancient Polynesians were master navigators, having settled Hawaii likely between 300 and 600 CE. They read the skies like star maps, memorizing where certain constellations appeared at different times of the year. But they also observed details many of us might overlook: the swirl of currents, the flight paths of certain birds, and yes, even how specific shellfish or sea snails behaved with the changing seasons. Now, this is where it gets delightfully peculiar. There's a fringe tidbit whispered about in some local tales that certain snails were believed to sing in calm weather. It's unlikely they were belting out a tune from The Little Mermaid, but there were accounts of faint, rhythmic ticking noises that happened when the water temperature rose just a bit, possibly from the movement of the snail's muscular foot inside the shell. Did it really sound like a lullaby? Maybe not. But can you imagine leaning in, straining your ears in the quiet night, hoping to hear a snail's serenade? That's certainly one way to avoid scrolling social media. Snail watchers in the old days might have included priests or community elders who looked for anything out of the ordinary. The color on a shell could shift slightly with weather patterns. Maybe it darkened when certain algae flourished, indicating the start of a rainy period. A quip some storytellers like to use is, if the snail shells look grumpy, brace for a storm. Okay, that might be a bit of modern sarcasm creeping in, but it does capture the way people anthropomorphize nature's signs. Historians still argue whether the practice of snail observation was truly codified into a formal seasonal calendar, or if it remained just an informal cluster of observations passed down orally. Some cultural experts insist there were chants specifically referencing the changing shells, while others say it was more of a side note, overshadowed by bigger, more established navigation and agricultural markers like star positions or tidal fluctuations. It's a fascinating debate because it underscores how these societies might have used multiple layers of knowledge, layer upon layer of tiny details that, taken together, painted a grand picture of life's rhythms. As you shift your gaze from the snail shells to the horizon, you can almost picture a small group of ancient Hawaiians, lit by torchlight, squatting near the same tide pools you're gazing at. They notice the snails cluster in certain spots when the waters start to cool, or they see that the shells grow thicker in years when the ocean is warmer. A possible adaptation to different conditions. They might exchange quiet jokes about it. If our snails are wearing thicker coats, maybe it's time to stock up on breadfruit. You can't help but crack a smile, even as you start to yawn. But where's the comedic relief for you? sitting in your comfy pajamas, sipping on something warm while listening to this. Well, let's toss in a gentle laugh. Imagine being an apprentice to the village elder. Your job is snail duty. You're told, make sure to note every new swirl, every new color shift. Meanwhile, your friends are out fishing, surfing, or, in modern terms, binge, watching their favorite show. It's a noble job, but you're not going to find many exciting stories in snail watching, unless, of course, the snail scuttles away faster than you expect, which is comedic in its own right. All around you, the night hums with the quiet synergy of wind, waves, and the distant strumming of maybe a ukulele if you're lucky. There's a sense of timelessness here. The same stars that guided ancient canoes sparkle overhead, and the same snails that once indicated the shifting season still crawl along reef rocks, leaving glossy trails in their wake. The environment might have changed over centuries, but for a moment, you can feel yourself bridging the gap between the ancient world and the present, guided by these humble creatures. Let your eyelids grow heavier as you envision the silhouette of a Polynesian double, hulled canoe drifting in the distance, tiki torches flickering on board, and the soft glow reflecting on the water's surface. The navigators dip their paddles in unison, following something more subtle than a smartphone app. Watching the color of the sky just before dawn, the dance of the wind on the waves, and perhaps the snail shells on the ocean floor that gather in certain patterns beneath certain tides. Even the slightest clue could be the difference between a successful journey and an endless search across the blue expanse. This is your gentle start in the Hawaiian night, a lullaby of whispers carried by the breeze, the faint crunch of shells underfoot, and the shimmering mysteries they might hold. It's not a grand epic. Rather, it's an invitation to look closer at the small wonders that ancient islanders held dear. You're standing at the threshold of a story that, for many, might seem boring. But give it time, and you'll find it surprisingly enchanting, much like a hidden tide pool brimming with life at midnight. You turn away from the moonlit shoreline, where you've been marveling at the tiny shells, and let your gaze wander inland. The land rises in gentle folds, covered in lush greenery that's dark and mysterious in the night. The soft croaking of koqui frogs echoes through the distance. Though, let's be honest, you might wish they'd read the memo about bedtime being quiet time. Still, there's something soothing in their rhythmic call and response, like a nocturnal chorus to accompany the ocean's lull. As you stand there, a faint, warm breeze carries the faint scent of hibiscus, and you recall that these islands are steeped in legends. Tales as vast as the ocean that cradles them. Ancient Hawaiians, like other Polynesian peoples, possessed elaborate origin myths explaining how the world, the islands, and all living things came to be. For them, nature was alive with stories. The crashing waves were the breath of gods. The lava flows the fiery tears of a goddess, and the humblest creatures, yes, even the unassuming sea snails, played roles in this grand tapestry. Consider, for instance, one whispered legend of the snail that traveled with the goddess of fertility, trailing glistening slime that seeded the land with new life. According to this story, every swirl in a snail's shell represented a different realm of creation, from the underwater domain of sea spirits to the volcanic heart of the island. Is it scientifically accurate? Maybe not, but it's certainly more poetic than reading a dry textbook explanation of snail anatomy. A well-known historical fact is that the Cumulipo, an 18th century Hawaiian chant of cosmic origins, offers a sweeping account of how life emerged, beginning with a primeval darkness and culminating in the emergence of gods and humans. While the Cumulipo itself doesn't fixate on snails, it does celebrate the interplay of countless creatures, all of which share a divine connection in the Hawaiian worldview. Snails, fish, birds, plants. None are an afterthought. Each creature is essential to the grand design, holding its place in a lineage that stretches beyond time. But you're here for those earliest whispers of snail watching, right? Picture a group of islanders huddled around a small fire. Sparks dance skyward, and the night air is thick with the fragrance of roasted taro and freshly caught fish. One elder is recounting the genealogies of the gods, explaining how the land itself was born from the union of sky and sea. In hushed tones, they also mention certain shelled guardians that appear in the shallow waters when the year tips toward the rainy season. The younger listeners might glance at each other, some rolling their eyes behind the elder's back. Can you blame them? Hearing yet another story about snails might sound as thrilling as reading the world's longest ingredient label. But in these tales, truths are folded into metaphors. Some legends say that if a particular snail species, sex, with a striped shell that glimmers in the moonlight, started to cluster in tidal pools at a certain time of year, it was a secret sign from the gods that the next harvest would be abundant. This might sound far-fetched until you remember that ancient societies often correlated animal behavior with natural cycles. And indeed, certain marine species become more active or more visible when the temperature, salinity, or food sources shift. Natural phenomena that can coincide with changes in the seasons. Here's a quirky or fringe tidbit that wanders around in a few lesser known accounts. A myth that the first sea snail arrived on the islands clinging to the feathers of a giant bird deity. The bird was said to have soared across the Pacific, scattering life forms on whichever island it visited. Most mainstream historians would say that's just a colorful story, but who's to say those imaginative details didn't preserve some faint memory of how migratory birds and ocean currents help distribute species? Maybe it's a case of myth embellishing a real ecological process, just dialed up to 11. Now, historians still argue whether some of these mythic references to snails, or to any small creature, really indicate an organized practice of observation, or if they were simply metaphorical placeholders in a tapestry of spiritual teaching. Some scholars assert that Polynesians meticulously tracked every living thing around them for signs of changing weather or cosmic events. An early form of citizen science, if you will. Others claim the stories were more about moral lessons or cultural identity than they were about actual biology. The truth probably lies in the middle, hidden in the folds of communal memory, passed down through chants and hula. As you step deeper into the island's interior, the night air seems to thicken around you, carrying voices from the past. An ancient kahuna, or priest, might beckon you closer to a torch, lit clearing to share how the very shape of the coastline was molded by powerful gods in ancient times. Perhaps they'd make a wry joke. Yes, even back then, humor existed. About how humans often think they run the show, but in reality, they're just guests on the gods' stage. That's one joke for the night. Let's keep count. You follow the kahuna's voice across a narrow footpath, weaving between towering breadfruit trees. A vine-laden trunk creaks in the breeze, dropping a succulent fruit near your feet. Another person in your group steps aside awkwardly, nearly losing their balance. It's a comical moment in the hush of night. You manage not to laugh out loud, but it's there, an appreciation for how the simplest things, like a falling breadfruit, can stir you from the story's spell. As you continue, you come to a natural pool, surrounded by ferns and half-submerged lava rocks. In the water, you see small snails gliding slowly across the stony bottom. Moonlight slices in, illuminating their shells in silver-blue hues. The scene could be out of a moody art film, with the snails as the reluctant stars. Who would have guessed you'd find yourself so transfixed by these unassuming creatures? Perhaps that's the second little joke. You're here for the snails, but you're also delighting in the entire wonder that is Hawaii's primordial story. Above you, the canopy parts just enough to reveal a ribbon of stars. If you tilt your head back, you might spot constellations recognized by Polynesian navigators' clusters that guided their epic voyages across the largest ocean on Earth. As they charted the stars, they also charted tides, winds, migrating whales, and yes, even the cycles of tiny sea snails. Everything was connected, forming a layered network of signs and omens that made up the fabric of daily life. The air shifts, carrying in the distant sound of waves once more, reminding you of how close the ocean remains, even when you venture inland. You pause to take it in, this sense of unity between land and sea, mortal and divine, past and present. These mythic origins may not answer all your modern questions about dating seasons or reading snail shells like lines in a cosmic poem, but they plant the seed of curiosity, the realization that, in the ancient Hawaiian worldview, nothing was too small, too boring, or too trivial to be part of a sacred narrative. You share a grin with someone else in your imaginary expedition, maybe cracking a third light joke. Next time we see a snail crossing the sidewalk, we should probably bow. It's that gentle blend of reverence and humor that keeps you relaxed yet enthralled. Because, after all, it's not just about gleaning facts, it's about embracing the subtle enchantment that arises when you open your senses to the stories embedded in every leaf, every star, and every shell. The snails in these mythic tales may seem like a tiny footnote in the grand cosmic narrative, but you're starting to see how they represent a crucial puzzle piece, a reminder that the tapestry of life is woven from threads of every size, color, and shape. And as you breathe in the balmy island air, you realize that, mythic or otherwise, these origins invite you to slow down, pay attention, and connect. just as those early Hawaiians did long ago. You make your way back toward the shoreline, still trailing the path of soft sand illuminated by the moon. The waves are whispering their steady lullaby, and your feet sink into the cool, damp ground with each step. Something about the way the night air and the rhythmic surf cradle your senses sets the perfect stage for diving deeper into the subtle signs that once helped the early Hawaiians mark the seasons. You approach a small tide pool, kneeling to observe the variety of creatures within. Hermit crabs crawling briskly, starfish gently clinging to submerged rocks, and of course, the ever-present sea snails. Squinting in the low light, you notice how the snail shells can range from smooth and shiny to rough and pitted. Some snails have more pronounced bands or stripes, while others display muted, almost camouflage-like patterns. It's not exactly an underwater fashion show, but you can appreciate the snail's version of haute couture. Now, in ancient Hawaii, people paid attention to these subtleties as if their lives depended on it. Because, in many ways, they did. A mainstream historical fact: the early Hawaiians employed a lunar calendar that divided the year into months named for significant natural events, like the blooming of certain plants, the arrival of specific fish, and changes in the environment. Within that framework, local observers claimed that certain snails displayed more vibrant coloration, or emerged in greater numbers when the weather shifted toward the rainy season. If snail shells turned deeper shades, it could hint that the sea's temperature was cooling or that the ocean chemistry had changed. This, in turn, might align with certain months in the lunar calendar when taro or sweet potatoes were ready to plant or harvest. Imagine you're a young farmer out in the fields, scanning the horizon for clouds that might bring nourishing rains. Meanwhile, your fishing buddies are down by the reef, net in hand, noticing that the snail population along the tide pools seems extra dense. They joke with you at the end of the day. Well, if the snails are partying, the taro's probably thirsty. You roll your eyes good-naturedly at the simplistic wisdom, but a seed of curiosity is planted. So maybe you sneak down to the beach the next morning, spot a cluster of these color-shifting shells, and decide to sow your crops soon. And lo and behold, the rains come right on schedule. It's enough to make you think the snails really do know what's up. Historians still argue whether the sea snail factor was truly a consistent sign or merely an occasional observation that got folded into local lore. Some maintain that there is strong evidence for season-specific chants referencing shells changing color, while others suggest it's more of a poetic flourish in Hawaiian mythology, not to be taken too literally. The debate continues as anthropologists sift through oral histories and songs, trying to parse real ecological data from symbolic language. Much of the debate hinges on how literal these references were intended to be. Were they describing actual, observable color shifts or weaving a spiritual allegory about life cycles? Then there's the fringe tidbit, a rumor that certain snail shells would emit a faint glow on nights leading up to a new moon, if the snails had been feeding on luminescent algae. Was it a trick of the light or a genuine natural phenomenon? The stories vary. Some claim to have witnessed a soft, ghostly light pulsing through the shell's spiral, while skeptics roll their eyes and attribute it to enthusiastic imaginations. Either way, it's yet another reason early Hawaiians might have kept one eye on the snail population. Who wouldn't be curious about living glow sticks shuffling around in shallow water? One comedic scenario might be the early morning fisherman, who, still rubbing sleep from his eyes, wanders down to gather bait. He sees these faintly glowing shells in the dark and nearly jumps out of his skin, certain he's stumbled onto some sorcery. As it turns out, it's just dinner for the snails meeting some phosphorescent algae. Even in ancient times, you can imagine someone chuckling about the fisherman's scare. Let's say you're following the footsteps of these old observers. You set up a small torch by a tide pool at dusk. Carefully, you mark the snail shells with small, natural pigments, an ancient version of tagging, so you'll know which ones you've already studied. Over the course of a moon cycle, you track their movements, noticing that during certain phases, these tagged snails seem to migrate to different parts of the reef. Then you cross-reference it with the local weather patterns. Maybe the trades are lighter, or the waves are calmer during that time. Over a few months or years, these notes start to form a pattern. These snail sightings, shell color changes, or snail migration might overlap with certain seasonal shifts. It's almost like collecting puzzle pieces. Some puzzle pieces are the big, obvious ones, like the position of the sun or the blossoming of a specific fruit tree. But then there are the small but crucial corner pieces, like how snail shells get a slight amber tint when the water warms. Sure, You could probably live without that detail, but it rounds out your understanding of the bigger picture. Another small bit of humor, you can just see a more modern scenario. Someone on a beach vacation tries to bring home a handful of these shells as souvenirs, only to have a local say, "Careful with that. You might be bringing back next week's weather forecast." The tourist stares blankly, not realizing there's a kernel of truth behind the playful warning. This diligence in observation also connects to the broader Polynesian tradition of reading the ocean. Navigation wasn't just about the stars, it was about everything below them too. The tide pools, the currents, the coral reefs, the presence of certain birds. Together, they formed an all-encompassing system of knowledge that made it possible to survive and even thrive in a place that to outsiders might seem like an isolated paradise, but to insiders was a complex network of resources and signs. And speaking of networks, you might recall from your daydreaming walk inland how the watchful elders recorded nature's tiny signals. As part of the community's living library, not all signs were snail-related, of course. The rustle of palm fronds could tell you something about wind direction. The crispness in the morning air might hint at a seasonal shift. Even the ocean's color, deeper blue or somewhat milky, could indicate whether certain fish were plentiful or if coral was under stress. But the snail was a special marker because it inhabited that liminal space between sea and land, existing on reef surfaces and in tidal pools, bridging two worlds. You rest on a sun-warmed rock, letting your legs dangle in the water, eyes adjusting to the glimmer of shells in the moonlight. The hush of the night is occasionally punctured by the scuttle of a crab or the rush of a wave. You muse about how, in a digital age, we rarely even notice these changes unless we get an alert on our phones. Ancient Hawaiians, on the other hand, had to be intimately attuned to every subtle shift in their surroundings. Perhaps that's a final gentle punchline for this section in modern times. We might see an unusual snail and think, "Someone call the aquarium," while our ancestors might have thought, "Oh, that means it's time to start planting breadfruit." It's humbling to realize how a simple creature we often dismiss can be so deeply intertwined with the rhythms of life on the islands. You trail your fingertips through the water, watching a snail inching along a rock, completely oblivious to your presence. Somewhere in that slow motion is a record of the seasons, an annual tapestry woven shell by shell. And as you rest here, lulled by the push and pull of the tide, you begin to understand how these subtle patterns might have guided entire generations, shaping harvest times, feast days, and even the daily routine of preparing meals or weaving nets. Small wonders indeed, but wonders just the same. You slip away from the quiet tide pools and move inland once again, following the faint glow of torches and the distant, melodic thrum of drums. The darkness is softer here, illuminated by lanterns made of coconut husks. In the flicker of their light, you notice a gathering of people dressed in woven garments. Their voices harmonize in a chant that resonates with the rhythm of the surf. Even though you're a good distance from the shoreline now, something in this communal energy suggests a celebration is in full swing. Moving closer, you see large tables laid out under a canopy of palm leaves, bearing offerings of fruit, roasted fish, and breadfruit poi. The air is rich with the smell of sweet potatoes and taro. At the center of the gathering, a ceremonial altar displays woven baskets filled with shells, including the small, spiral sea snail shells that have caught your attention all night. You can't help but recall how their subtle coloration might have signaled the changing seasons. Now they seem to serve another role, tokens of gratitude for nature's bounty. In ancient Hawaii, celebrating the harvest was an integral part of life. A mainstream historical fact is that festivals like the Makahiki honored Lono, the god of fertility and agriculture, spanning roughly 4 lunar months from October to February. During this period, warfare was set aside and communities focused on feasting, competitions, and offerings to ensure prosperity. At times, the offerings included shells, possibly sea snail shells, placed on altars to represent the cycle of life and the marine gifts that nourished the people. That might seem unusual to modern eyes, but in a culture so attuned to the sea, nothing was off limits in the quest to maintain balance with the environment. Here you see dancers swaying in mesmerizing patterns. Their ankle bracelets jingle with tiny shells as they step to the drum's hypnotic beat. You pause to appreciate the artistry. Each movement mimics nature, from the rolling waves to the flight of birds overhead. And you can imagine that some dancers also replicated the gentle spiral of a snail shell, a graceful turn or pivot symbolizing the slow, deliberate path of these creatures. On the edge of the scene, a group of kids tries to mimic the dancers, and one of them loses a shell anklet mid-spin. The clattering sound draws a few giggles, the child's cheeks flush, but then a gentle elder pats them on the back, and laughter erupts all around. You wander over to the altar where an elder is placing freshly gathered snail shells into a small woven bowl. They hum a soft chant under their breath. Words you can't fully understand, but the melody feels ancient, reverent. You stand quietly, trying not to disturb the moment, when the elder catches your eye and gives you a knowing nod. It's as if they're inviting you to witness how something as mundane as a snail shell can become sacred when woven into community ritual. Historians still argue whether snail behaviors truly played a direct role in scheduling some of these celebrations. Some believe snail appearances correlated with certain harvest times so reliably that they became part of the ceremonial calendar. Others suggest the shells were mainly decorative or symbolic, representing the ocean's abundance, rather than acting as a practical calendar tool. It's a debate that can spiral as intricately as a snail shell itself, and no conclusive answer has emerged. After all, in many oral traditions, symbolic meaning and pragmatic use are tightly intertwined, making it tricky to parse which was primary. A humorous anecdote floats around. A small circle of elders would gather before the festival to compare notes on snail shell patterns. If they disagreed, they might swap shells and squint at them like art critics, each claiming their snail's hue was proof that the rains would arrive imminently. Picture them holding shells up to the torchlight, arguing if that swirl of color was more cloudy gray or stormy gray. It's a scene reminiscent of modern relatives bickering over a paint swatch in a home remodeling project. Observing the festival's atmosphere, you notice that many participants wear leis made not only of fresh flowers but also of shells. Some leis use the more striking shells of larger marine snails, while others incorporate the smaller, more common sea snail varieties. Their soft clacking as people move creates a light percussive background that complements the distant drums. You wonder if these shells have been gathered over many months, carefully selected for shape, color, and maybe even the signs they allegedly carry. Another fringe tidbit surfaces in local storytelling. Certain remote communities were said to have a shell whisperer, a person who supposedly could interpret shell patterns to predict the exact timing of seasonal shifts or even spiritual phenomena. They might run a finger along the shell's spirals, reading it like a palm reader interprets lines in the hand. Of course, many modern experts roll their eyes at this, calling it folklore. But you can't help but be intrigued, imagining a hush falling over the crowd as this shell whisperer declared, "Prepare for heavier rains next month. The shells have foretold it." In the midst of all this, a group of children races through the festival grounds, weaving between food stalls and nearly colliding with the dancers. They're shrieking with laughter, chins gleaming from the sticky juices of fresh pineapple. One child trips and lands with a squeak on a patch of damp grass, snail shells scattering from a small pouch. The child scrambles to collect them again, while the others tease, snail caretaker, you lost your precious forecasts." It draws hearty chuckles from onlookers, a sweet reminder that these shells, sacred or not, are also part of everyday play. You find a spot near the drum circle, sinking onto a woven mat. The vibrations of the drums pulse through your body, the rhythmic thump almost lulling you into a trance. A few folks next to you are sharing a local brew made from kava, offering a comforting, earthy taste. As you sip, you close your eyes for a moment, letting the confluence of sounds carry you, shells rattling on dancers' ankles, laughter from children darting in and out of the crowd, the low hum of chants, and the steady, deep heartbeat of the drums. The highlight of the night arrives when a group of elders steps forward, chanting in unison. They circle the altar where the snail shells lie, and each elder lifts one shell reverently toward the sky. The chant intensifies, a fervent plea or thanksgiving, maybe both, to the spirits believed to dwell in the sea and the land. You watch with quiet wonder, your thoughts drifting back to the tide pools you visited earlier. It's one thing to see snail shells strewn across the sand in random clusters. It's another to see them offered up in a sacred harvest festival that ties the entire community together. And so, in this moment, you realize that what might appear trivial, an unremarkable swirl of calcium carbonate on a beach, can become a gateway to ritual, celebration, and gratitude. If the snail's behavior helps signal the right time to hold these festivals, then it played a crucial part in sustaining the community's spiritual and agricultural well-being. Or perhaps the snail was just one more facet of the island's wondrous tapestry, woven into the ceremony for the sake of completeness. Either way, you feel the depth of reverence here, a reverence that flows from people who understand their intrinsic link to the natural world. You rise to join the dancers, swaying with them in the warm night air. The shells on your improvised lei rattle gently, creating a soft percussion in time with your steps. And as you move, you can't help but picture those little snails at the tide pool, blissfully unaware of the pivotal role they might play in marking time, bringing people together, and reminding everyone that harvests aren't just about collecting food, they're also about gratitude for life itself. Leaving the warm glow of the celebration behind, you wander into a quieter stretch of beach, where the sand feels cool under your toes and the only light comes from a pale moon. Your mind is still buzzing with the thought of snail shells showcased on altars and worn as ornaments during festivals. Now you start to wonder, just how organized was this snail-watching tradition? Did early Hawaiians meticulously chart snail behavior like they did phases of the moon, or was it more of a casual observation that slipped into myth and folklore? You stand at the water's edge, contemplating that question while the gentle surf laps at your ankles. Imagine a scenario where an entire calendar system exists, based not only on lunar cycles, but also on the color patterns and sightings of particular snail species. It's an intriguing image, someone hunched over a reef at dawn, carefully counting snails or scribbling notes in the sand about their hues and positions, all to decide if it's time to prepare for makahiki or plant the next round of crops. Here's where the scholarly debates come crashing in like a sudden wave on a calm night. Historians still argue whether the ancient Hawaiians formalized a dedicated snail calendar, or merely referenced snails as one of many environmental clues. Some anthropologists point to chants that mention sea creatures appearing at certain times of year. They say these clues could amount to a systematic chart when pieced together. Others insist that the references are too sporadic, more poetic than literal, and that the real backbone of Hawaiian timekeeping was the lunar cycle, with snails playing only a cameo role. A mainstream historical fact: you might recall the Hawaiian lunar calendar, known as the Mahina system, typically divided each month into 3 10-day weeks. Farmers and fishers made decisions based on which nights of the moon cycle favored certain activities, like planting taro or netting fish. It's well documented that these monthly rhythms were central to planning. Yet, the question remains whether snail observations were codified in parallel, almost like an appendix, to the main lunar calendar, or if they were anecdotal notes passed along by particularly observant elders. On a more fringe note, there's a legend in one corner of the islands that claims an entire chant, rumored to be over 1,000 lines long, was devoted exclusively to snail behavior across each month of the year. This chant allegedly tracked snail migration, shell color shifts, and even the snails rumored sing incessant. Remember that surprising tidbit. However, no documented version of this snail chant has ever been found, leading some to dismiss it as pure folklore. Still, the rumor persists like a stubborn snail clinging to the reef, a testament to how these stories can burrow into cultural memory, even without tangible proof. Picture a gathering of modern scholars in a room filled with old scrolls, chanting references, and archaeological notes. One academic, arms folded, might argue that any mention of snails is simply symbolic of the ocean's fertility, no more important than references to fish or crustaceans. Another might point to obscure lines in a centuries-old hula, insisting they describe the exact snail shell patterns visible during the rainy season. The two scholars lock eyes in a stalemate while a third rolls their eyes dramatically, like, "Great, we're fighting about snails again." If there were ever an anthropological debate that could benefit from a comedic punchline, it's this one. That said, the methodical approach of early Hawaiian society is well documented in other areas. They were precise navigators, adept farmers, and keen astronomers. It's not inconceivable that such attentive observers would also keep close tabs on marine life. Archaeological findings in Hawaii show shell middens, basically ancient garbage heaps, containing vast numbers of shells sorted by species. Some interpret this as evidence of purposeful collection for food, ornaments, or even tracking, whereas others say it's just a sign of dietary habits. The notion of using snail shells as timestamps for seasons remains tantalizingly unproven, yet it won't go away. Imagine stepping back in time to see a record keeper, for lack of a better term, drawing lines in the sand. Each line might represent a day or a lunar phase. Placed at each interval could be a snail shell, either newly collected or marked with a specific color. If the shell's shade had deepened, or if the snail's behavior shifted, it might mean the next rains were due. Or, conversely, if the shells stayed the same for too long, maybe it was time to pray for better fortune in the upcoming harvest. You'd see islanders approach the record keeper with curiosity, some skeptical, others devout believers in the shell's silent wisdom. One comedic image, a local prankster swaps out the snail shells for ones gathered from a different reef known for different coloration. The next morning, the entire village is in a panic. What do you mean it's monsoon time already? The confusion quickly clears once the elder who oversees the calendar arrives, scolding the prankster with a stern lecture and maybe a playful smack with a rolled-up mat. Even in antiquity, jokes happened. And sure, you might get exiled for messing with the community's sense of time, or at least assigned extra chores. Another dimension to these debates is the possibility that Snail watching was more about ceremony than raw data. For instance, maybe the presence of certain snails near the shore functioned as a spiritual sign, like an auspicious signal to begin a festival or to conduct a particular rite. This would intertwine practical observation with religious significance. In many Polynesian cultures, daily life and spirituality were inseparable, so it's entirely plausible that snail sightings carried both mundane and sacred weight. Critics of the snail calendar idea often highlight that the real star of Hawaiian seasonality is the environment's broader cues, changes in rainfall, ocean currents, wind patterns, and the blossoming cycles of native plants. They argue that snails couldn't possibly give more reliable or advanced notice than these other factors. But defenders push back, suggesting that snails might have been one piece in a mosaic of indicators. Perhaps even an early warning system. If certain snail shells changed hue a week before the rains typically arrived, that could be valuable supplementary information. You stand there, letting the ocean breeze wrap around you, amused at how such a small creature can spark such big debates. Then again, think about how your own modern life is filled with data points. Everything from weather apps to social media alerts. The ancient Hawaiians didn't have smartphones, but they had finely tuned senses and a wealth of communal knowledge. Why shouldn't snails have been part of that equation? You glance down at your feet, half expecting to see a snail making its languid journey along the sand. The beach is empty under the moon's glow. Still, you can almost hear the quiet voice of the ocean, as though it's whispering secrets of seasons past. Could the color of a snail shell really signal a time to harvest breadfruit or begin preparations for a long voyage? If you listen closely, maybe you'll hear a resonant yes, but with a wink, as if nature itself is in on the joke. Ultimately, no single piece of evidence has laid this question to rest. Scholars might bicker about interpretative angles, but the debate remains, like footprints in the wet sand, ready to be washed away and redrawn by each new wave of research. You can't help but smile, thinking this conundrum could be a perfect bedtime story in its own right, the mystery of the snail calendar. Perhaps the real answer lies not in definitive proof, but in the synergy of environment, observation, and belief. So, you continue along the dark shoreline, leaving the realm of academic disputes behind for now. The hush of night folds around you, and a gentle wave kisses the sand near your toes. In your mind's eye, you imagine an ancient observer crouched at the tide pools, scanning for a snail that might confirm or challenge the season's arrival. Is it all speculation, or was there once a carefully maintained tradition, lost to time and overshadowed by grander stories of star navigation and epic voyages? The truth, like those snail shells glimmering under the moonlight, might be more nuanced than meets the eye. You keep walking, letting the waves chase you softly up the shore. The moon veils itself behind drifting clouds, and with each step, you sense a shift in the air, like a gentle warning that weather changes might be on the horizon. In ancient Hawaii, being able to detect subtle signs of an approaching storm was a matter of life and death, especially for those who ventured onto the open ocean. It didn't help that storms could roll in suddenly, obscuring stars and complicating the elaborate navigational techniques for which Polynesians were so famously skilled. Picture a small double, hulled canoe out on the water, the crew scanning the skies at twilight. They notice the wind picking up and realize they may not see the stars clearly once the thick cloud bank moves in. The waves become more erratic, their rhythm changing from gentle swells to choppy crests. In that moment, the voyagers begin looking for any clue to either find shelter or steer in the safest direction. Maybe they remember an old story, watch for the snail signs near the reef if a storm might come. It might sound trivial, but when you're out there on an endless expanse of ocean, even the smallest hint can guide you. A mainstream historical fact underscores this point: Polynesian wayfinders navigated thousands of miles without modern instruments, relying on stars, ocean swells, seabird flight paths, and even the temperature of the wind. Ships that arrived in Hawaii centuries ago brought people who had memorized star compasses and had an uncanny sense of direction. They understood that storms often led certain fish, and by extension certain snails, closer to shore. It was an intricate web of cause and effect. If you saw an unusual gathering of sea life near the reef, it might mean that rough seas were pushing creatures inland, giving you a clue about shifting weather patterns. Walking along, you recall how earlier you entertained the idea that snail shells could predict the rainy season. Now you imagine them helping navigators read the signs of an imminent storm. Maybe a cluster of snails turned up on a beach that rarely saw them, leading an experienced canoe captain to say, "We head back now, or we'll be fighting the god's wrath by morning." It's easy to see how these small indicators could get folded into the grand tapestry of seafaring wisdom, especially in a culture that prized acute observation of nature. Historians still argue whether Polynesian navigators consciously used snail patterns as reliable storm markers, or if that's more of a romantic notion embroidered onto the real feats of navigation. Some scholars emphasize wave patterns, wind direction, and star position as the primary tools, asserting that any mention of snails was incidental, like a footnote in a much larger manual. Others propose that everything in the environment was fair game. If you can glean even the tiniest advantage from the humble snail, why wouldn't you keep it in mind? Perhaps the truth is a mosaic of both perspectives, layered over centuries of trial and error. Let's slide in a quirky tidbit, often whispered about in coastal legends. Certain snail species, when startled by abrupt changes in atmospheric pressure, might climb to higher rocks or cling to spots above the usual tide line. Some old-timers joked that these snails were better meteorologists than the entire fishing village combined, because they sensed oncoming turbulence faster than humans did. If you spotted snails awkwardly perched in unexpected spots, it might be time to batten down the hatches. Of course, whether they truly sensed barometric shifts or simply followed the retreating tide is up for debate, but you can bet at least one eager fisherman used that as an excuse to go home early from work. "Hey boss, the snails have spoken." You can conjure a fun image: a star navigator, renowned for memorizing celestial paths, strolling onto the canoe with a single snail in hand. "Yep, I found this guy on top of a rock. Storms must be brewing." Cue the rest of the crew rolling their eyes, but then by midnight, thick clouds blot out the moon, and the wind howls. The crew collectively turns to him with raised eyebrows, grudging respect, and perhaps a snarky remark like, "Guess we should have brought more snails for a forecast update." Despite all the seriousness surrounding storms, you know there had to be light-hearted moments. Maybe one navigator carried a special snail shell as a good luck charm, and teased his fellow sailors who insisted on more scientific methods. Or another joked that if you see snails wearing tiny life jackets, it's definitely time to head ashore. Silly as it sounds, humor can thrive even when storms loom, offering a momentary release of tension. One might ask, how did people handle actual navigation once a storm hit and the sky was hidden? That's where the broader suite of Polynesian knowledge came into play. They'd observe the direction of swells, the color of the water, and the flight patterns of seabirds. The point is that in dire circumstances, every clue counted. The ocean is a harsh teacher, after all, and if certain snail behaviors aided in anticipating rough seas, it could be a quiet lifesaver. You continue along the moonlit beach, noticing how the breeze has picked up. Palm fronds rustle overhead in increasingly urgent whispers. The night sky seems to close in as thicker clouds drift by, swallowing up the stars. You pause, imagining this scene in centuries past. A group of sailors on the cusp of departure, scanning the horizon with concern. The thought might cross your mind. Could a quick check of the tide pools provide reassurance or a reason to delay the voyage? In the background, you hear a distant rumble, possibly thunder out at sea. A small crab scuttles across your path, burying itself in wet sand. Then your gaze lands on a cluster of snail shells near a rock. They're motionless, of course, but you can't help but wonder if you've stepped right into the type of scene where ancient observers gleaned crucial knowledge. It's slightly eerie yet comforting, a testament to how humans have always sought to decode nature's messages, large and small. Now, if you were writing a comedic script, you might spin this into a slapstick scenario. A panicked villager tries to gather up all the snails as storm barometers, while the wind whips at their hair and the ocean roars. The village elder, half laughing, shouts, "They're not personal weather reporters. Let them be." The villager stumbles over an incoming wave, snail shells flying everywhere, only to realize the storm is already upon them. In real life, though, there's a quieter drama in these interactions with nature, no less intense, but certainly less theatrical. The ocean's power humbles you. Even on a calm day, Its expanse feels infinite. In stormy times, it can be downright intimidating. Early navigators had no illusions about taming it. Instead, they formed an alliance of knowledge, reading the patterns in the sky, the water, the behavior of birds and sea life, and maybe even in the subtle scuttling of snails. It's a grand puzzle, and each piece matters when a storm can be the difference between returning home laden with fish or never coming back at all. So you stand there, letting the waves wash over your ankles, the distant thunder urging you to find shelter. It feels like a small glimpse of what ancient Hawaiians might have experienced. They'd gather their canoes, decide whether to sail or wait, and maybe joke about how their snail watchers needed a raise if the storm caught them off guard. The comedic relief might be short-lived if the weather turned truly ferocious, but at least it provided a moment of levity. As you contemplate these possibilities, a gust of wind nearly topples you. Sprays of ocean mist pepper your face, and the stars are now invisible behind thick cloud cover. You get the sense you're at the brink of a squall. That's your cue to move inland, to the safety of higher ground. But as you do, you steal one last glance at the sea, half expecting the snail shells to glow or shuffle up the shore like a wave of miniature prophets. Of course, they stay put. The magic, if there is any, lies in the perspective you choose to adopt. You hurry away as the wind whips through the palms, hearing the first fat raindrops splatter on the sand. The question lingers in your mind: did these early islanders really trust snail behavior to predict storms, or is that just a charming rumor? Maybe it doesn't matter. In a world where knowledge was gleaned from every corner of nature, no detail was too small. If the snail offered even a sliver of insight, it became another thread in the larger tapestry of survival and seafaring adventure. You slip further inland just as the rain begins to taper off, and the moon emerges hesitantly from behind the ragged clouds. Streaks of silver light glide across the damp foliage, illuminating a narrow footpath. Eager to leave behind the stormy beach, you follow the glow, noticing that the crashing waves have softened to a distant murmur. The air smells fresh, tinged with wet earth and the faint perfume of night, blooming flowers. As you wind deeper along the path, faint chanting draws you toward a torch-lit clearing. There, a circle of people sits cross-legged around a small fire. Their faces glow in the dancing flames. An elder speaks in hushed tones of legends passed down through generations, tales of moon goddesses, shapeshifters, and mystical creatures that glide through the reef at night. The elder's voice drops even lower when they mention a snail known locally for its almost otherworldly glow under moonlight, the moon snail. They call it a creature rumored to carry lunar magic in its shell. A mainstream historical fact is that many Hawaiian myths connect the moon, the goddess Hina, for instance, with the cycles of life, fertility, and transformation. These narratives often underscore how the moon's phases guide planting, fishing, and essential ceremonies. Hearing of a moon snail in this context feels almost natural. Of course, a snail might be touched by the moon's spirit if everything else in nature resonates with lunar energies. But there's something else about these moon snail stories, a kind of fringe allure that suggests more than mere admiration of a pretty shell. One legend claims that under a full moon, the snail's shell would shimmer in peculiar patterns, revealing messages from the goddess Hina herself. If you squinted just right, you might see flickers of images, like tiny hieroglyphs swirling inside the spiral. Historians still argue whether this was actually a reference to a known bioluminescent effect in certain marine snails, or just a poetic flourish. The debate continues, fueled in part by old chants that describe the snail who spoke for the moon. You settle at the edge of the firelight, curiosity piqued. The elder's voice shifts into a melodic chant, and everyone around joins in, their eyes reflecting the moon's glow. You catch a playful whisper from a young observer. If the snail starts singing back, "I'm out." That's the first joke that tickles you. Imagine a snail belting out show tunes in the middle of a sacred gathering. Probably not going to make it onto any reality talent show. But hey, stranger things have been claimed in legends. As the chanting fades, the elder recounts a story of a young priest who supposedly discovered a rare snail on a remote reef. According to the legend, whenever a full moon rose, this snail's shell glowed faintly like a lantern, guiding lost canoes safely home. Families whose loved ones were out at sea would line the shoreline at night, holding these glowing snails aloft like cosmic beacons. One comedic angle, you can imagine some modern influencer trying to replicate it, holding up a random snail and filming a TikTok, only to get a faint "leh" from their unimpressed audience. In the hush that follows, you might wonder if such a snail actually existed. Perhaps there's some scientific basis, like certain mollusks feeding on bioluminescent plankton or algae. But so far, no definitive species in Hawaii is known to glow brightly enough to serve as a literal lantern. That doesn't stop the story from persisting, though, embedded in the cultural tapestry of moonlit legends. Sometimes, a good story has a way of sticking around, even if reality can't quite keep up. The elder goes on in times of famine or severe storms. Communities would perform a special ceremony to appease the moon goddess, offering carved shells as tokens of devotion. If the goddess was pleased, she might bless the people with clear skies or abundant fish. You picture the ceremony, maybe a line of men, women, and children walking slowly along the beach at dusk, each holding a shell up to the bright lunar disk, chanting softly for nature's mercy. Historians still debate whether these ceremonies were performed widely across the islands or limited to a few coastal regions. Some argue that the most well-documented rituals featured more obvious lunar connections, like fish that appeared only on certain moon phases. Snails, they suggest, would have been secondary or even incidental. Others maintain that specialized snail-focused rites did occur, pointing to lesser-known chants that mention the snail's connection to Hina. Without a time machine, it's hard to settle the matter. Meanwhile, these lively arguments in academic circles are likely echoed by the spirits of long-departed elders, who might chuckle over how we modern folks fret about the details. You hear another gentle joke from within the circle, a witty remark about how the moon snail is the night's paparazzi, always shining a little spotlight wherever it crawls. You can't help but grin. Even in an ancient setting, it's easy to imagine a reverent commentary about the mystical luminescence. People can be devout and playful at the same time, after all. Reaching into a woven basket by the fire, the elder lifts out a glossy spiral shell, large enough to cradle in two hands. The elder holds it up, letting the moonlight catch its surface. For a split second, it seems to glow. Probably just reflection, you tell yourself. But your heart leaps anyway. Sometimes, the line between myth and reality is so thin, it's a wonder we manage to walk it without stumbling. That's the charm of these cultural tales. They reflect a worldview where every living thing bears the imprint of divine influence. A snail becomes a messenger of the moon goddess, weaving through tidal pools at night, leaving faintly shimmering trails that, if you follow them, lead you to hidden coves or secret fishing spots. It's the kind of magical realism that saturates oral traditions, enchanting entire generations who pass the stories on like heirlooms. At this point, you might start to doze under the gentle warmth of the fire, lulled by the rhythmic hush of the chant. Your mind drifts through images: a star-laden sky, a shimmering snail shell, a crew of sailors guided home by moonlit signals. Then a giggle bubbles up as you think about the snail singing. If only bedtime stories came with a built-in lullaby courtesy of our slow-paced friends. Though it might be more like a glacial hum than an actual tune. The crackle of the fire snaps you back to the present. The elder gently places the large snail shell back into the basket, as if tucking a precious heirloom to sleep. A final chant begins, quieter than before, a lullaby praising the moon's pale glow across the island. You feel the day's fatigue settling into your bones, a comforting weight urging you to surrender to rest. You close your eyes for a moment, listening to the soft melody of voices and the faint chirping of night insects around you. In the quiet, you sense a current of gratitude flowing through the circle. Even if these snail legends straddle the line between the real and the mythic, they've forged a sense of wonder that connects people to the broader tapestry of life in these islands. Is that not the essence of cultural tales? To remind us that every shell, every creature, every moonbeam holds a story worth telling. Half asleep, you imagine a snail gliding up a moonbeam to whisper secrets to the goddess Hina, and who smiles knowingly and sends it back down to the reef with a new swirl in its shell. A coded message for those patient enough to see. You might chuckle at this whimsical image, but there's beauty in the thought that ancient Hawaiians found deeper meaning in even the smallest forms of life. Someone stirs the fire, sending a swirl of sparks into the night sky. The moon's snail tails linger in the smoke and drift through the clearing. For a moment, the moon slips behind another cloud, and you open your eyes to see the circle shrouded in a softer darkness. In that darkness, the elder's voice carries on gently, weaving threads of myth, memory, and gentle humor that you carry with you as you drift closer to slumber. The moonlight has shifted higher into the sky by the time you slip away from the fireside circle. You let the hushed glow guide you further along a narrow path. The gentle hum of insect life and the whisper of wind through palm fronds accompany your thoughts, which linger on the snail legends you've just heard. If snails could hold such rich cultural and spiritual value, you wonder what other curiosities these islands have shared, or traded, with the wider world. You pause in the darkness as an image forms in your mind, a canoe arriving at a distant shore, loaded with fragrant sandalwood, bright feathers, and, yes, gleaming shells. You recall that Hawaiian society wasn't isolated, far from it. Early islanders engaged in extensive trade, not only among themselves but also with other Polynesian islands and, eventually, with European explorers and traders. A mainstream historical fact is that by the late 18th and early 19th centuries, European ships began frequenting Hawaiian shores, intrigued by local resources, from whaling prospects to exotic flora, and even the shells that adorned Hawaiian garments and headdresses. But trade in Hawaii had been thriving long before Europeans appeared. Voyagers navigated canoes to distant archipelagos, exchanging goods like tapa cloth, prized feathers, and occasionally shells that showcased the island's natural artistry. For many, the shell jewelry worn by high-ranking chiefs was a highlight. Intricate necklaces and bracelets, with each shell painstakingly polished, were more than mere accessories. They signaled status, wealth, and spiritual connection. You can almost see a regal figure in a ceremonial cape, stepping off a canoe with shells clinking softly at the wrists and ankles, each shell a testament to hours of craft and the abundant marine life surrounding the islands. Now, the comedic side of such trade encounters is not hard to imagine. Picture a European trader, eyes as wide as saucers, enthralled by the shimmering shells on display. He might hold one up, twist it around in the sunlight, and proclaim, "I must have this wondrous gem for my mantel." Meanwhile, a Hawaiian artisan shrugs, amused by how a foreigner, fresh off a creaky wooden ship, would view something so common as if it were a priceless jewel. The local children might giggle behind their hands at the trader's over-the-top enthusiasm. As you walk deeper into the island's interior, the path opens to a small clearing where you stumble upon a makeshift workshop. Lanterns dangle from tree branches, casting warm light onto a bamboo table piled high with shells. Some large and conical, others small and hauled. A few artisans sit there, carefully drilling holes to string shells into necklaces, or filing edges to create decorative patterns. The rhythmic chipping and scraping forms a steady backdrop, reminding you that art often requires patience and a keen eye. Historians still argue whether certain snail shells were ever used as a form of currency in these islands, akin to cowrie shells in other parts of the world. Some scholars propose that these particular shells, prized for their rarity or unique coloration, might have served as tokens of exchange in high-stakes negotiations or as ceremonial gifts to seal alliances. Others maintain that while Hawaiian society placed great value on shells for adornment and ritual, they didn't operate as a standardized currency. The debate continues, fueled by scattered oral traditions and the occasional shell hoard unearthed at ancient sites. Take a moment to imagine a village elder bartering with a merchant from a neighboring island. The elder opens a wooden chest revealing a trove of glossy snail shells, each with delicate stripes. The merchant's eyes gleam with interest. Perhaps he's heard rumors of snail shells being used in sacred Hawaiian ceremonies. He might offer woven mats, rare spices, or even prized sea turtle shells in exchange. A friendly banter ensues, each side trying to outdo the other. One can almost hear a light-hearted comment, "If your snail shells can also chase away my mother-in-law, I'll pay double." Jokes aside, these small objects could symbolize entire networks of alliance and shared knowledge. But the allure of these shells didn't stop at Polynesian neighbors. With increasing Western contact came a fascination for the exotic, and Hawaiian shells became prized curios in European drawing rooms. Naturalists and collectors would pay handsomely for specimens, conch shells, cowries, and even the humble snail shells if they bore an unusual pattern or color. Letters from visiting explorers sometimes wax poetic about the island's unbelievable array of shells, each more exquisite than the last. Meanwhile, you can see a local rolling their eyes, thinking, "You should see how excited they get about a piece of coral." Next, they'll want to buy sand. One fringe tidbit suggests that some sea snail species, believed to carry hidden healing properties, were packaged and shipped abroad in small crates. The rumor goes that certain groups in Asia or Europe ground the snail shells into powders for use in potions or medicines. Was it true, or was it just another piece of seaside gossip that spread among sailors with a penchant for tall tales? Hard to say. The idea of snail shell powder as a panacea certainly strays into the realm of old-world mysticism, but it wouldn't be the first time rumors of magical cures spurred a bustling trade. In this workshop clearing, you notice a young artisan holding up a snail shell to the lantern's light. They tilt their head, gauging how best to carve a graceful pattern into the shell. Nearby, another carver finishes threading shells into a necklace, shaking it gently to hear the soft rattle. You're reminded of the legends you heard earlier, that the shells might sing or glow under certain conditions. But here the focus is more commercial, more tangible. These shells might one day grace the neck of a visiting dignitary or be traded across vast swaths of the Pacific. Every so often, a curious traveler stumbles upon this clearing, much like you have now. Perhaps they trade a small figurine or a trinket they carried from another land in exchange for a handful of shells. As they depart, they might ask about the myths they've heard. Did these shells really connect to moon goddesses, and could they forecast storms? And the artisans, busy shaping and polishing, might offer a knowing smile, saying simply, "In these islands, all things are possible if you listen closely." You can't help but imagine the traveler leaving with more questions than answers. Then there's the comedic notion of some hapless outsider trying to replicate Hawaiian shell craft back home. Picture them showing off a snail shell necklace to friends, bragging about how it wards off bad luck, or changes color with the seasons. Next thing you know, half the town is wearing imitation snail shells that do absolutely nothing, except maybe rattle annoyingly in a breeze. A local might roll their eyes and think, if only they knew the real intricacies behind each swirl in that shell. You reflect on how these shells have multiple layers of meaning: spiritual relics, status symbols, trade commodities, and intangible curiosities. They link the Hawaiian Islands to a vast network of maritime exchange, bridging cultures and sparking curiosity about the region's natural wonders. And through it all, the snail shell remains quietly itself a product of nature's intricate design, shaped over time by the same forces that shape the reefs and tides. At last, the artisans begin to pack up their tools for the night. Shell fragments glimmer on the table like a trail of tiny stars. One of them looks up at you, noticing the interest on your face, and offers a small shell as a gift. You feel a rush of gratitude as you run your thumb over its smooth surface. The swirl of its pattern seems to whisper of ocean depths and ancient knowledge, a quiet reminder of how these islands have always found value, both practical and profound. In the simplest of things, you tuck the shell into a pocket, a token from this hidden workshop, and continue on your way. The path leads back into the embrace of tall palm trees, leaving the ring of lantern light behind. Overhead, the moon stands high and steady, illuminating leaves glistening with recent rain. In your pocket, the shell clicks softly with each step, as if echoing the countless trades and travelers who have carried Hawaiian shells far and wide across the globe. Whether they were seen as exotic curios or treasured spiritual talismans, these shells have woven themselves into a story larger than the islands alone, a testament to the interconnectedness of the ocean and those who dare to explore its shores. You press on, carrying the shell in your pocket like a secret talisman. The path narrows, edged by dense foliage that smells of moist earth and ripe fruit. Overhead, the canopy is thick enough to blot out much of the moonlight. Between the rustling leaves, you catch glimpses of stars, distant pinpricks that feel oddly comforting. You sense that you're drifting toward a quieter region, perhaps a place where some practices are kept hidden, reserved for those who know the taboos and respect them. In ancient Hawaiian culture, as in many traditional societies, certain activities were subject to kopu, strict prohibitions that governed daily life and upheld social order. It was a mainstream historical fact that anything from fishing in specific spots to touching objects set aside for chiefs could be kopu. These rules could be seasonal, gender-specific, or tied to special events. Among the kaleidoscope of regulations, you find whispers about snail collection. Some clans or regions forbade gathering snails in certain months, citing various reasons, from ecological balance to ritual purity. You reach a small clearing where the night sky winks through the treetops. To your left, you notice a carved wooden sign, partly covered by vines. Its symbols are faded, but you make out something that suggests prohibition, perhaps a warning to travelers to respect local customs. Indeed, one tradition claims that if you breach the taboo and collect sea snails during the sacred months of harvest, you risk offending the spirits who watch over the reefs. That might sound dramatic, but for people whose livelihoods depended on maintaining harmony with nature, it was anything but. Historians still argue whether these snail-related taboos were uniformly enforced across all islands, or were just localized beliefs. Some scholars cite chants referencing the snail that must not be taken during the full moon of Lono. Others consider it a poetic metaphor, not a formal rule. The debate rages on, much like the broader question of how thoroughly snail behavior factored into Hawaiian culture. But for local communities, whether literal or symbolic, these guidelines help preserve certain reefs, ensuring the snail population remained robust enough to maintain the ecological balance. As you skirt the clearing, a faint glow catches your eye. Peering through the undergrowth, you see a small shrine composed of stacked stones. Atop it sits a single snail shell, pale with faint striations that resemble tiny waves frozen in time. Someone has placed fresh green to leaves around it. You sense the hush in the air, an unspoken command not to disturb this sacred offering. You can imagine a local elder scolding anyone who tries to remove the shell, perhaps muttering in exasperation, "Don't mess with the spirits, or they'll mess with you." It's easy to picture a comedic scenario, a wide-eyed newcomer or an overly curious child deciding to take that shell as a keepsake, only to be chased by a furious grandparent brandishing a wooden spoon. Or maybe the culprit gets inexplicably lost on the same night, wandering in circles until they return the shell to its rightful place. Even if pure coincidence, the story would travel. Don't anger the snail spirits, or you'll never find your way home. Navigating further, you pass through patches of thick vegetation and come upon a coconut grove. Shimmering threads of moonlight illuminate scattered husks on the ground. The air feels humid here, almost stifling. You hear the distant trickle of water, a small stream perhaps, where fish might gather to spawn under the moon's glow. It's not hard to imagine that in certain regions, collecting snails near these spawning grounds was deemed disrespectful. If you disturb one life cycle, you might disrupt many others. In your mind, you recall a fringe tidbit. There's an old belief that snails house the souls of restless ancestors. According to this legend, the taboo against collecting them during certain lunar phases wasn't just about preserving marine life. It was about letting these ancestral spirits roam free in the ocean. Could it have been a creative way to protect resources, or did some people genuinely believe that these shells hosted spiritual energies? With oral traditions, lines blur between practical conservation and mystical reverence. As you continue, the path forks. On the left, you see footprints heading toward a beach. On the right, a narrow trail climbs upward. You choose the right, weaving past ferns and twisted tree roots. The climb is gradual, and soon you find yourself on a gentle ridge overlooking the coastline. Even in the dim moonlight, you can make out the curve of the beach far below, where tiny pinpoints of firelight suggest a settlement or a small gathering. From here, you see the dark shapes of wave-lashed rocks jutting out from the sea. You wonder if certain coves beyond are declared kapu for snail harvesting, maybe because the snails there have particular importance in ritual. Perhaps each island had a region with its own variation on the theme, no collecting during certain months, or only collecting under a specific moon phase, or no collecting on nights when certain stars burned brightest in the sky. It's a complex patchwork of rules that likely reflected each community's unique ecology and beliefs. Of course, with such complexity, misunderstandings could arise. Imagine two neighboring villages. One believes snail collection is off limits during the rainy season, while the other sees no harm. Conflict might erupt if one group stumbles upon the other gathering snails at a forbidden time. Tensions flare, accusations of sacrilege fly, and elders have to convene a meeting to settle the dispute. It's a bit like modern neighbors squabbling over property lines. Only this time, it's about the moral and spiritual order of the world. But comedic relief is never far away. One might picture an exasperated elder sighing, "Can't we just agree on a snail schedule?" Maybe they draw up a rudimentary calendar, snail doodles in the margins, with angry faces during the copper times and smiley snails for the permissible months. You can see the younger folks stifling laughter, trying not to disrespect a serious cultural matter, but also aware of how it can verge on the absurd from an outsider's viewpoint. You pause on that ridge, breathing in the cool night breeze. The sound of the ocean is distant now, replaced by a softer rustle of leaves. You feel a certain respect for how these beliefs, taboos, and local variations kept ancient Hawaiians attuned to their environment. It might seem overcomplicated for modern sensibilities, but it functioned as a form of communal stewardship. By restricting when and how certain resources could be used, communities ensured they didn't deplete them. Snail populations stayed healthy, reefs remained vibrant, and the intricate web of marine life thrived. Easing down a different slope, you eventually find a winding path back toward lower ground. As you walk, you reflect on how you've moved through spaces that might have been off limits in bygone times. Perhaps you've unknowingly stepped over boundaries that were once strictly enforced, paying tribute to snail shrines and abiding by local ceremonies. You can't help but smile at the idea of a snail policeman, popping out of the bushes to issue you a citation for snail violation. But beneath the humor lies a profound truth. Taboos and local codes shape not just individual behavior, but also the collective psyche, forging a sustainable bond with the land and sea. You reach level terrain where ferns glisten with dew under moonlight, nodding gently in the breeze. The path back to the beach stretches ahead. In the distance, you spot the faint flicker of torches by the shoreline. Perhaps another gathering or festival you've yet to explore. But in this quiet moment, you think of all the invisible lines drawn through these islands, lines of permission and prohibition, lines that once dictated how and when humans could interact with even the smallest creature. Pressing your hand against the pocket that holds your gifted shell, you feel a subtle kinship with those ancient customs, sensing the weight of cultural heritage that shapes how people coexist with nature. Maybe there's more to a snail shell than meets the eye. It might be a barometer of environmental wisdom, a sacred amulet, a piece of currency, or a signal that a particular activity must cease for a while. And sometimes, it's just a pretty shell. Such is the tapestry of Hawaiian tradition, woven with threads of both practicality and myth. You continue through the moonlit landscape, eventually finding yourself on flatter ground where the vegetation thins out, offering a clearer view of the shoreline in the distance. The murmur of waves is softer here, filtered by rows of tall grasses that bend and sway as if they're greeting you. The moon casts a silvery path across a nearby inlet, and you sense a gentler rhythm in this place, an area perhaps shaped by human hands to coexist with nature rather than conquer it. Ahead, you notice the glimmer of water encircled by low rock walls. It reminds you of ancient Hawaiian fish ponds, ingenious structures designed to trap and cultivate fish while allowing the tides to flow in and out. A mainstream historical fact is that these fish ponds, known as lokoia, stand as a testament to early Hawaiians' deep understanding of aquaculture. They carefully position them to make use of natural currents, ensuring a steady exchange of fresh, oxygenated water for the fish. In this subtle dance between human craft and oceanic forces, you see echoes of the balanced approach to living that characterized these islands for centuries. Stepping closer, you spy small hollows in the rock walls, nooks where water seeps through but fish can't easily escape. In these spaces, you catch sight of sea snails clinging to the stones or grazing on algae. Each snail seems right at home, its shell blending into the mottled texture of volcanic rock. You can imagine a caretaker in ancient times strolling by at low tide, checking the walls for signs of wear, and maybe pausing to watch the snails do their slow-motion wander. A gentle joke might spring to mind. Here's our night security. One snail that's never in a rush to clock out. But these snails, far from being freeloaders, contributed to the ecosystem's health. Their algae grazing helped keep water channels clear, preventing overgrowth that could block oxygen flow to the fish. Early Hawaiians recognized the synergy. Fish thrived in cleaner waters, and snails benefited from a safe habitat with a reliable food source. Some families might even have built small, snail shelters in or around the fish ponds, piles of loose rocks that offered hiding spots for these petite custodians. Whether these structures were deliberate or an accidental byproduct of fish pond maintenance remains a matter of debate. Historians still argue whether snail-specific shelters were a conscious strategy or simply part of the broader design for water flow. Imagine a caretaker quietly rearranging stones to form stable crevices, glancing over their shoulder to see if the snails had moved in overnight. There's a tender humor in that image, like a landlord eagerly checking if tenants have found the new apartment cozy. Did they tack up miniature snail art in there? Probably not, but you can't help picturing it. Yet, the relationship went beyond mere convenience. Early Hawaiians were masterful stewards of natural resources, ensuring that fish ponds could provide for generations without depleting the ocean's bounty. By integrating sea snails into this environment, intentionally or otherwise, they created a micro-ecosystem within the pond walls. No creature existed in isolation. The fish needed the algae, the snails kept the algae in check, and humans maintained the entire system so that everyone, human and marine life alike, could benefit. A fringe tidbit whispers through local lore a story that certain families specialized in whispering to snails, coaxing them to cluster in designated rock piles to avoid predators. While that might sound like a tall tale, it aligns with the more general Polynesian tradition of chanting or speaking gently to nature, believing that respectful words could influence the spirits dwelling in animals and plants. Could some caretaker have had a special knack for making snails feel at ease? Perhaps. Or maybe they just knew the snail's favorite algae buffet. In any case, it adds a dash of enchantment to the notion of snail shelters. Walking around the perimeter of the fish pond, you notice a partially collapsed section of the rock wall. Here the water flows more vigorously, eroding the stones. Peering into the gap, you spot small clusters of snail shells. It's tempting to pick them up, but you remember the many taboos about collecting shells. Even if those taboos don't apply in every region, a pang of respect stops you. Besides, these shells might still be home to live snails doing important work beneath the water's surface. You step carefully along a narrow ledge, glimpsing fish darting below. The moonlight refracts on the water, creating dancing patterns of light and shadow. In the old days, perhaps an extended family gathered here to maintain the fish pond. Men, women, and even children might line up in the shallows, removing debris, checking for leaks, and adjusting the rock piles. A comedic moment might arise when a particularly slimy snail decided to hitch a ride on someone's foot, prompting laughter and a bit of squealing. Work had its playful moments. Another corner of this watery haven reveals a small wooden platform. On it sits a basket of taro stems, left to soak. It's not unusual. Taro is a foundational crop, grown in both wet and dry environments. Taro patches often neighbored fish ponds, sharing irrigation systems that cleverly circulated water. You picture a caretaker balancing on that platform, scanning the pond for any sign of a problem. An overgrowth of algae, a tear in the wall, or a decline in snail activity. If the snails seem sparse, they might wonder if pollution or a predator was at play. It's a quiet form of environmental monitoring, centuries before the term sustainability made its way into modern vocabulary. Historians still discuss the extent to which early Hawaiians deliberately encouraged snail populations around these fish ponds. Was it a direct strategy, akin to our modern concept of integrated pest management, or simply a fortunate side effect of careful pond construction? Some point to scattered oral histories praising snails for their role in keeping the ponds clean, while others find no explicit instructions for snail husbandry in traditional chants. Perhaps the truth lies in the unspoken synergy: if you build it well, creatures will come, and they'll do their part if you do yours. A more light-hearted aspect might be the competition between neighboring fish pond keepers. Could you imagine them boasting about who had the best-fed snails or whose ponds had the shiniest shells? It sounds like a comedic twist. Oh, you've only got dull shells this season. Maybe you need better algae. Rivalry aside, such friendly banter would underscore the communal ethos. Everyone had a stake in preserving healthy ponds, because a failing pond threatened the shared food supply. The glow of the moon continues its slow trek across the sky, and you feel a gentle tiredness setting in. The fish pond seems to exhale a cool breath of air, as if inviting you to rest in its stillness. You wonder how many generations of hands have shaped these stones, carefully placing them, one atop the other, to create a sustainable lifeline for the community. Even the snails, in their tiny, unassuming way, helped form this legacy. Leaning against a sturdy coconut palm near the pond's edge, you let your mind drift. You picture a family seated around a small evening fire, sharing stories of the day's work. Maybe an elder scolds a younger child for poking at the snails, reminding them that each creature has a job. Another family member jokes that the snails have a better work ethic than some humans, since they never stop munching algae. Amid the laughter, you sense the underlying message of respect for all living things. As a breeze ruffles the palm fronds, you cast one last look at the pond's surface. The reflection of the moon ripples gently, and in its shimmering edges, you can almost see tiny silhouettes of snails gliding along in a patient bollet. They're part of a hidden network, each snail playing a vital role in sustaining the ecosystem. It's a lesson in cooperation, humility, and faith in nature's balance. Your eyelids grow heavy, lulled by the soft hush of water lapping at the stones. The pond stands as a quiet monument to human ingenuity and the silent labor of sea snails. Together, crafting a sustainable way of living. You turn to leave, heart warmed by the notion that sometimes, in the smallest corners of the world, the biggest stories unfold. You leave the fish pond behind, drifting back toward a winding footpath that disappears among tall grasses. The night air clings to you in a soothing embrace, as if the island itself wants you to stay in this hush. The moon has climbed higher, making the landscape glow with a gentle radiance that reveals every rock, every bending blade of grass. As you wander, you catch the faint sound of chanting in the distance, a melodic hum that seems to rise from the earth itself. Drawn by the voices, you follow a narrow trail, stepping over tangled roots and ducking under low, hanging branches. A warm light dances ahead, flickering like a beacon. Soon, you come upon a clearing where a group of figures sits in a circle, illuminated by a small fire at the center. Their chants are soft yet resonant, each syllable blending seamlessly into the next. There's a hypnotic quality to the rhythm, pulling you closer. You slip quietly to the edge of the gathering, finding a spot on the damp grass. No one seems startled by your arrival. Perhaps they already sensed a newcomer was near. The chanting continues, and you begin to catch phrases here and there, references to the moon, to the ocean's pulse, and intriguingly, to the snail's journey from tide pool to shore. One voice rises above the others, reciting lines that speak of shells as symbols of cyclical growth, each hall a chapter in life's unfolding story. A mainstream historical fact is that Hawaiian chants, olive, served myriad purposes, from recounting genealogies to offering blessings and telling creation stories. Some oli were deeply sacred, accessible only to those initiated in certain rites, while others were communal, teaching everyday wisdom. It's not hard to imagine how sea snails, ever present along the coast, found their way into these chants as emblems of persistence and resilience. The snail, after all, carries its home upon its back, transforming gradually over time, just like humans do. As you sit there listening, you notice that each chant flows into the next without pause, as if weaving a continuous tapestry of meaning. The lead chanter, an elder with grey, streaked hair, occasionally gestures with a snail shell in hand, passing it around the circle. When it's offered to you, you see faint carvings on the shell's surface, tiny lines that could be decorative, or maybe they're an attempt to mark different lunar phases. You're too mesmerized by the hush of the chants to examine it closely, though, and you pass it along with a respectful nod. Historians still argue whether these snail-focused chants were purely metaphorical, or if they contained practical instructions encoded in poetic language. Some scholars believe that references to snail shells darkening or brightening with the seasons were cryptic ways to teach farmers about impending weather shifts. Others say such lines were purely symbolic, meant to highlight spiritual truths about life's spiraling path. The debate echoes through academic journals, one side insisting on pragmatic undertones, the other maintaining that the snail is just a handy motif for meditative reflection. A fringe tidbit surfaces among the more esoteric traditions. Certain chants allegedly included a spiral chant, so powerful that when performed under a specific moon phase, it could compel snails to move in unison, creating patterns in the sand. Imagine that, an entire snail choreography orchestrated by human voices. Skeptics roll their eyes at this notion, likening it to mermaid sightings or magical beanstalks. Yet, the story persists in a few secluded communities, whispered about late at night when the line between the mundane and the mystical blurs. The chanting transitions into a gentler melody, and a soft drumbeat begins. The glow of the fire flickers over the chanters' faces, revealing expressions that are serene, almost trance-like. One chanter, a middle-aged woman with a lie of small shells, raises her hands and begins reciting a segment that likens the snail's protective shell to the protective love of ancestors. She smiles as she speaks, and a child next to her nods in earnest agreement, though a slight giggle escapes when the woman mentions snail kisses. The child obviously picturing an actual snail smooching someone. That's one comedic flash, and you can't blame the kid for losing composure at the idea of a slimy little kiss. The air seems to shimmer with the energy of voices in harmony. You notice one chant that repeats the phrase, rise with the tide, fall with the tide, as if capturing the snail's daily routine along the reef. In a gentle comedic aside, you imagine a snail wearing a tiny watch, alarm set for the tides, grumbling when it has to get up for its daily algae brunch. The mental image draws a silent chuckle from you, a light-hearted respite in the midst of these deeply reverent rituals. Shifting your position, you see a small, painted gourd near the elder. It's adorned with snail motifs spiraling around its center, reminiscent of a labyrinth. Could it be used for ceremonial water? Perhaps it holds an herbal infusion that the chanters drink between verses. Whatever the case, it speaks to the significance these islands place on natural symbols. To them, nature isn't just a backdrop but an active participant in the spiritual dialogue. Eventually, the chanting pauses, and the elder addresses the circle, reflecting on the themes woven through the night's oli. Snails, they say, remind us that slow, steady progress often outlasts sudden bursts of energy. The shell's spiral can mirror life's winding journey, where each loop represents a new lesson or phase. In a society that once depended on reading the environment for survival, it made sense to see the snail's path as an allegory for persistence through changing seasons. There's also a comedic story shared among the chanters about a fisherman who tried to rush a snail by putting it on his canoe paddle, thinking it would move faster if surrounded by water. Instead, the snail clung stubbornly, refusing to budge. The fisherman lost patience and flung the snail into the sea, only to have it land on a submerged rock a few feet away. Hours later, he found the snail had arrived back at his net before he did, as if to say, "I'll get there on my own time, buddy." The circle shares a round of quiet laughter at the fisherman's misdirected efforts. After the laughter dies down, the elder begins a final chant, this one slower and softer than the rest. It echoes through the clearing in gentle waves. Like a lullaby for the island itself, words intermingle with the rustle of leaves and the distant hiss of the ocean's tide. You feel your eyelids grow heavy, lulled by the rhythmic cadences. There's a sweetness in the air, as though the night is cradling these chants for safekeeping. In the lull that follows, the chanters bow their heads, drawing the night's session to a close. One by one, they place the snail shell artifacts into a woven basket near the fire. You see the variety: some shells are large and conical, others small and speckled. All seem treated with reverence, like miniature archives of the island's wisdom. Could each shell be linked to a particular chant, or perhaps to a lineage that passed down snail watching lore? You sense the weight of history in that basket, as though each shell embodies countless verses. The circle begins to disperse, and you stand, legs a bit stiff from sitting so long. You offer a small nod to the elder, who returns it kindly. A few other participants smile as they gather their things, a quiet camaraderie among those who've shared in the chants. You take one last look at the basket of shells, half tempted to reach out and trace a finger over the carved spirals. But something tells you those shells have their own journey, waiting to be carried forth by the keepers of these ancient songs. As you walk away, the clearing darkens behind you, the fire reduced to smouldering embers. The chants still echo in your mind, their harmonies weaving into the hush of the night. Snails as metaphors might sound whimsical, but you've felt the power in the words, how they meld observation with deeper truths about life cycles. Perhaps this is the essence of Hawaiian tradition, blending the tangible and the intangible until even the quiet crawl of a snail becomes a chorus of meaning. The sky's darkness starts to fade along the eastern horizon, hinting at the approach of dawn. You follow a winding trail, leaving the clearing of snail chants behind, drawn by the distant sound of surf. The air smells faintly briny, and the whisper of the wind through palms beckons you forward. Before long, you reach a small cove where a few outrigger canoes are pulled up onto the sand, their hulls slick with salt and dew. Despite the dim light, you spot silhouettes moving about, a small crew preparing to launch into the early morning calm. They're stowing gear, unrolling sails, and murmuring quiet words of caution, as though mindful not to wake the spirits that dwell in the pre-dawn hush. You decide to keep your distance, observing from behind a cluster of rocks so as not to intrude. But your curiosity pulses, imagining what it must have been like when ancient Polynesian voyagers first arrived on these shores, guided by star maps, ocean currents, and, if some rumors are to be believed, the occasional sign from sea snails. A mainstream historical fact underscores the marvel of Polynesian seafaring. By roughly the 13th century, these navigators had settled nearly every habitable island in the Pacific, establishing far-reaching connections across an ocean that covers over 60 million square miles. They used a repertoire of natural cues, celestial navigation, swell patterns, bird flight paths, to make voyages that would intimidate even modern sailors. But as you've gathered from local lore, signs on the reefs could serve as omens too. Your footsteps leave shallow imprints in the damp sand as you skirt the cove. Waves lap gently at the hull of an older canoe, its wood darkened from years of exposure. Overheard, you catch a snippet of conversation between two crew members. "Remember last time we ignored the snail shells on the reef?" One says, a playful warning in their tone. "Yeah, I remember the storm that gave us all a saltwater bath." The other replies with a lopsided grin. You stifle a laugh. That's your first comedic nugget, the notion that missing a snail omen spelled trouble at sea might feel a touch melodramatic, but in an era without digital forecasts, why not heed every sign you can get? Historians still argue whether sea omens, like the gathering or behavior of snails, were genuinely factored into navigational decisions. Some documents mention sea creatures clustering in harbors before storms, while others dismiss such details as mere superstition overshadowed by more rigorous methods, alike star paths and wave patterns. Yet, the persistent presence of these tales suggests they held sway in maritime culture, at least enough to shape a few legends and jokes passed down through generations. You make your way toward the waterline, letting the shallows swirl around your ankles. A small wave recedes, revealing a snail shell half buried in the sand. You crouch to examine it. Its spiral is chipped, but the subtle pattern of lines remains visible in the pale dawn light. You wonder if a sailor once held this very shell, squinting for clues about the weather or the sea's mood. A few yards away, the crew readies a canoe. One of them calls out, "We sail at daybreak." If any more snails wash up, we're counting it as a good omen. There's your second comedic moment. You picture a snail scuttling onto the sand, just in time for the launch, and the sailors bursting into applause, like a tiny cheerleader for their voyage. An elder among them, possibly the captain, wades into the water and places a small offering. A bundle of Thai leaves and a shell lay into the surf. This quiet act might be an appeal to the sea gods, or a tribute to ancestors who once braved these waters. The elder's voice carries softly on the wind a quick chant calling upon ocean currents and favorable breezes. The words resonate with respect for the ocean's vastness, a reminder that even the most seasoned navigator remains humbly aware of nature's fickle nature. Drawing a little closer, you hear them discuss potential routes. They're heading to a neighboring island for a trading mission, presumably a shorter trip by ancient standards, perhaps just a day's sail if conditions are right. But the conversation brims with caution. One mentions the tides, another references the wind direction. Then someone half-jokingly inquires, "Did the snails give us the green light?" The others chuckle, rolling their eyes good-naturedly. You can't help but smile at the dynamic, a blend of modern practicality and ancestral superstition. A fringe tidbit surfaces in your memory. Some sea-going families believed a single snail shell placed at the prow of the canoe could ward off misfortune. Others claimed it ensured the canoe stayed on course, attracted to the shell's spiral as if by invisible magnetism. Of course, physics doesn't support that, but who's to say what effect belief can have on a crew's confidence? Ancient Hawaiians often blended tangible skill with intangible faith, forging a worldview that harmonized everyday survival with spiritual reverence. The horizon warms with a thin stripe of gold, and the crew pushes the canoe into deeper water. They work in unison, stepping gingerly over submerged rocks. One crew member slips, narrowly avoiding a tumble, drawing laughter and a teasing remark. "Maybe we should have brought more snail shells for luck." That's your third comedic jab. It underscores how these references to snail omens have become playful banter, even if no one is fully banking on a snail prophecy to save them. You wade out to where the water laps at your calves, watching as the canoe glides smoothly out of the cove. The sail catches a faint breeze, and the vessel begins its gentle tilt forward, setting a course toward the open sea. The morning light grows brighter, revealing a sky brushed with pastel hues, lavender, pale blue, and a hint of coral. It's a scene of delicate beauty, but beneath the surface lies a potent truth: the Pacific is as unforgiving as it is breathtaking. Early Hawaiians learned to decode its every mood, forging a resilience that modern life sometimes forgets. You can almost picture a grand voyage centuries ago, multiple canoes laden with supplies, families, and maybe a few stowaway snails clinging to the hull. In the hush of night, navigators would scan the stars and feel for subtle changes in the swells. If they encountered reefs teeming with active snails under certain conditions, perhaps that was enough to spur a change in route or a decision to wait out the night. Even if snail omens were but one thread in a vast fabric of oceanic knowledge, sometimes a single thread can hold the entire tapestry together. Yet, not every sailor believed in such signs. Some likely scoffed, insisting the ocean had plenty of other, more reliable indicators: cloud formations, wind direction, or the shape of wave patterns against the hull. The comedic tension between practical and mystical seafaring might have been as old as seafaring itself. You imagine two navigators on the same canoe, one meticulously charting star angles, the other flipping over a snail shell in their palm, as if it could whisper secrets. Maybe they bickered, maybe they laughed. In the end, though they shared the same horizon. The canoe in front of you disappears around a rocky outcrop, the crew's voices fading into the rhythmic pulse of the sea. A light wind ruffles your hair and tugs at your clothes, as though urging you to keep exploring. The tide creeps in, inch by inch, carrying small shells and pieces of coral in its wake. You stand there, immersed in the hush of dawn, feeling a subtle kinship with all those who've gazed at these waters, seeking guidance in the interplay between the known and the mysterious. Finally, the sun's edge breaks above the ocean, spilling gold across the waves. The day feels new, brimming with unspoken possibilities. In that first flash of morning warmth, you recall the old saying passed among Hawaiian navigators: "Hiwa himoku, himoku hiwa." The canoe is an island, and the island is a canoe. You sense how everything — snails, sailors, storms, reefs participates in that exchange. On some level, each creature and every phenomenon can serve as an omen or a guide, if you're willing to pay attention. You turn back toward the beach, footprints dissolving behind you as the tide inches over them. The fleeting nature of those prints underscores how ephemeral our presence is compared to the ocean's vast timeline. Yet, you carry a piece of these stories with you. The snail shells that might signal safe passage or an oncoming storm, the jokes swapped among the crew, the deeper conviction that knowledge can come from the tiniest of signs. With the sun rising higher, you take a final look at the open ocean before stepping onto the dry sand. Perhaps you'll never fully resolve whether snails truly served as omens, or if it's all just maritime folklore. In a world that merges logic with myth, both explanations can coexist. After all, in these islands, practical wisdom and enchantment often sail hand in hand, leaving room for the possibility that even a humble snail can illuminate the path across the boundless blue. A rosy sunrise greets you as you step inland again, leaving the gentle roar of the surf behind. The path meanders through a patch of coastal forest where tall ironwood trees sway in a faint breeze. Their needles hiss softly, reminding you of whispered secrets carried on the wind. You breathe in the warm, slightly salty air, letting the afterglow of dawn guide your thoughts. In the distance, you see small houses clustered around a larger building, perhaps a church or an old missionary school. As you venture closer, the clang of a distant bell rings out, and you sense the shift of time, as if the old and the new have collided here in a single breath. Not so long ago, historically speaking, this island realm had no tall ships or foreign tongues calling out in harbors. But then came a wave of visitors, explorers, merchants, missionaries, whalers. They carried with them new beliefs, technologies that would reshape the Hawaiian way of life. A mainstream historical fact: in 1778, Captain James Cook first made contact with the Hawaiian Islands, sparking a surge of Western interest in these lush lands. Trade, disease, and cultural exchange followed, transforming the social and political landscape in a matter of decades. And along with these changes came a gradual erosion of traditional knowledge. You walk past an abandoned old building, its wooden walls weathered and sagging. Perhaps it once served as a place where locals learned foreign letters and arithmetic, missionary teachers imparting their own worldview, while inadvertently sidelining native customs. You imagine a child from that time, forced to memorize English grammar instead of chanting about snail shells and the tides. Sure, grammar's useful, but there's a sadness in how quickly ancient wisdom can be pushed aside. Historians still argue whether the decline of snail-focused traditions was directly caused by colonial influence or simply a byproduct of broader cultural shifts. Some point to documented incidents where missionaries discouraged pagan beliefs, including those tied to natural signs. Others note that rapid urbanization and Western-style schooling replaced oral storytelling with textbooks, crowding out local lore. The truth might be a blend: old ways faded in the face of new governance, new religions, and an altered economy, leaving snail lore to languish in the margins. As you continue, the forest thins, opening to a dusty road lined with modest wooden homes. A stray rooster pecks at the ground, indifferent to your presence. Farther up, you see a small chapel built from coral stone, a relic of the 19th century, still standing as evidence of a missionary era that once swept the islands. You can almost hear the echo of hymns in a language foreign to these shores, accompanied by the faint hush of surf. If you were to poke your head inside, you might see old pews and a battered lectern, the space haunted by the ghosts of fervent sermonizing. Here's your first light-hearted moment. You picture a flustered missionary trying to communicate with islanders who speak no English, wildly gesturing at snail shells while warning them that superstitions must be abandoned. Meanwhile, a local child stands by, snail in hand, thinking, this person must be off their rocker. If only they knew how crucial these shells are. The comedic disconnect is almost inevitable whenever two vastly different belief systems collide head-on. With colonization came new forms of land ownership, division of communal lands into private property, sugarcane plantations sprawling over once rich taro fields. That meant less reliance on the old rhythms of nature and more focus on cash crops. If you wander into the rural zones, you might find rows of sugarcane stretching to the horizon, where once fish ponds and snail-laden reefs had flourished. As money took priority, many islanders had to adapt or be left behind. The snail calendars, the seasonal chants, and the small rituals might have seemed less urgent when survival and economic stability demanded new skills. Standing in the shadow of a tall coconut palm, you can't help but think of the knowledge that slipped away in this transition. Yes, some families clung to the old ways, teaching children to read the reefs and watch the skies, but many others adopted Western habits. The Hawaiian language itself started to wane under the pressure of English speaking institutions, and with the language went nuances of tradition. Stories of snail omens, genealogical chants, and intricate metaphors lost in translation. It's like trying to replicate a centuries-old recipe with half the ingredients missing and no instructions. A fringe tidbit drifts around in local folklore. Rumor has it that a few adventurous Victorian collectors became obsessed with Hawaiian snail shells. They hired locals to gather them en masse for private collections in Europe, paying handsomely for rarities. It's said some species of land snails, already vulnerable, were pushed to near extinction by this mania. Whether that extends to sea snail populations is less certain, but the frenzy for exotic curiosities was real enough, and it contributed to a broader disconnection from how these shells fit into the island's ecological and cultural fabric. As you stroll, a battered sign catches your eye, a kind of community bulletin board outside a faded general store. You glimpse a few handwritten flyers, including an announcement for an upcoming cultural revival gathering. Join us this Sunday for hula kahiko and ancestral chants. There's a small line at the bottom that reads, featuring a talk on ancient snail symbolism. That's your second comedic moment, imagining a presentation about snail shells right after a lively hula performance, like a professor stepping on stage in the middle of a luau, pointing at snail diagrams. Yet, it also warms your heart to see efforts at preserving or resurrecting the knowledge that colonialism nearly buried. Much of what remains of snail lore is scattered. Elderly folks might recall half-remembered chants from their grandparents, while a handful of academics pore over translations of 19th century Hawaiian newspapers in search of references to snail behavior. Every so often, a dedicated cultural group organizes a workshop, teaching younger generations how to interpret natural signs. Picture a group of students on a rocky shore, each with a small notebook, trying to see if snail shells actually do show color variations that correspond to the rainy season. Cue a student rolling their eyes. Is this like snail science class? Sure, it might sound dull, but it's a bridge to a past that nearly vanished. One comical anecdote from the mid-20th century. A tourist pamphlet allegedly claimed you could predict your fortune by shaking a snail shell like a magic 8-ball and listening for clicks. Locals who came across that pamphlet must have laughed themselves silly, imagining tourists on the beach, head tilted to a snail shell, waiting for cosmic advice. If only it were that simple. That's your third joke. A subtle poke at how the outside world sometimes confuses or commercializes local traditions. But behind the humor is a lingering sorrow. Many authentic practices weren't just misunderstood. They were actively suppressed or overshadowed by Western norms. Government policies in the late 19th and early 20th centuries limited the public use of the Hawaiian language and emphasized Western education. Uncounted genealogies, chants, and ecological observations faded as elders passed away. The snail stories slipped into the background along with everything else. Historians still disagree on how aggressive that suppression was, but everyone agrees it left deep scars. Yet, not all is lost. The 1970s saw a renaissance of Hawaiian culture, known as the Hawaiian Cultural Renaissance. People revived canoe building, hula, the Hawaiian language, and they began to piece together forgotten ecological knowledge as well. You hear whispers of new interest in how early Hawaiians tracked seasons, including the possibility that snail shells and behaviors played a role. Modern marine biologists occasionally team up with cultural practitioners to see if there's any scientific basis for these old traditions. Sometimes they discover fascinating correlations, like certain snail species indeed reacting to changing ocean conditions. Other times, the data is inconclusive, leaving room for debate and, perhaps, a little mystique. You come upon a modest house with a broad porch. An elder sits in a rocking chair, quietly humming a tune that sounds suspiciously like one of those snail chants you heard earlier in the night. You stop and listen from a distance, feeling the weight of colonial history pressing around you, knowing how easily traditions can vanish under foreign rule, yet also witnessing the resilience of a culture that refuses to let its stories die. In that moment, you sense hope. Even if snail lore isn't as widespread as it once was, enough sparks remain to potentially reignite the flame. A gentle breeze rustles through the coconut palms lining the porch. The elder's humming shifts into soft words. You can't catch every syllable, but the melody conjures images of swirling shells, rising tides, and the cyclical dance of life. Perhaps it's an echo of a chant their grandparents once sang. Perhaps it's a brand new composition, blending old motifs with modern perspective. Either way, It's a sign that not every colonial footprint trampled the spirit of these islands. The knowledge may have retreated underground or into scattered fragments, but it survives in the hearts of those who remember, or those who care enough to learn anew. You close your eyes, letting that melody wash over you. When you open them, the elder is gazing into the sunrise, as though seeing both the past and the future at once. And as the sun inches higher, you imagine all the unsung stories of snail shells drifting through Hawaiian history, some lost forever, some awaiting rediscovery. Perhaps that's the bittersweet truth of colonial impact. It can overshadow tradition, but it can't extinguish it entirely. Seeds of ancient knowledge still lie in the soil, ready to sprout if tended with care. You linger near that humble house, listening to the elder's quiet tune as the morning sun paints the sky a bright gold. The melody stirs your curiosity. How much of that song is ancient, and how much is newly composed? Maybe it reflects the current revival of interest in old Hawaiian knowledge, particularly those rumors about sea snails and their connection to seasons. A gentle nudge of optimism pulses in you. Perhaps the lost verses of this tradition are inching their way back into collective memory, as resilient as snails themselves. Your feet carry you into a nearby town, which seems like a lively crossroads of past and present. There's a small library with a wooden sign, a cafe that smells of sweet pastries, and even a modest marine research station perched near a dock. Here, you get a glimpse of people who blend modern science with ancestral wisdom. A young researcher with a clipboard scurries past you, nearly tripping over a stray chicken. That's your first comedic moment. A researcher who can handle complex lab equipment, but can't dodge a rogue rooster. She regains her composure, shooting you a sheepish grin before hurrying off, presumably to track water temperatures or observe the local reefs. Inside the research station, you notice large tanks filled with marine creatures, small fish, coral fragments, and of course, various sea snails. One tank is labeled with a sign that reads, "Shell Coloration Studies Exploring Historical Claims." According to the lab notes pinned nearby, they're measuring how shell pigment changes with temperature, salinity, or nutrient availability. This is where ancient lore meets modern method. Scientists systematically testing whether snails really do respond to seasonal shifts in a way that might have been observable to early Hawaiians. It feels oddly thrilling, like watching a centuries-old rumor go through a rigorous modern fact check. Historians still argue whether these shell color changes were consistent enough to serve as a reliable seasonal marker. Some from the academic side insist the phenomenon is too subtle, maybe only visible after months of careful observation under controlled conditions. Others point to anecdotal evidence and say ancient Hawaiians had centuries to notice patterns we might overlook in a quick study. In one corner, you have the skeptics, rolling their eyes at snail mania. In the other, you find enthusiastic champions who want to decode the puzzle once and for all. You can't help but chuckle quietly at this second comedic tidbit. Who would have thought snails could spark such heated debate in a modern lab? A mainstream historical fact stands out on one of the educational posters by the mid-1800s. Foreign naturalists were collecting Hawaiian shells en masse, documenting them for the Royal Society and other learned organizations in Europe. They marveled at the biodiversity but rarely paused to ask how locals integrated these creatures into their daily rhythm. Now the pendulum swings back. Local scientists and cultural practitioners are forging alliances, sharing observations, and dusting off old chants to see if some hidden kernel of ecological data lies within. It's a collaborative effort across disciplines, underscoring how knowledge can be cyclical, rediscovered generations after it's been set aside. You wander over to a small exhibit dedicated to cultural revitalization. Photographs show community workshops, elders teaching kids how to identify different snail species along the reef, a cultural practitioner leading a chant about the tide, a marine biologist explaining pH levels. A tagline reads, "Bringing the past forward, snail lore in the 21st century." You imagine a group of kids, snorkels in hand, scanning the reef for snail clusters and joking about who can spot the most. Storm predicting, snail. Third comedic scenario, one kid might brag, "My snail told me we're getting pizza for dinner tonight." Prompting eye rolls all around. Next to the photos, a digital screen loops short video clips. One shows an elder chanting softly as she gently holds a snail in her palm. Subtitles explain that she's reciting lines about the spiral of life, connecting the shell's halls to the phases of the moon. Another clip shows a scientist pointing to a chart of snail growth rates across different water temperatures. It's an odd juxtaposition. Mystical chant meets bar graph. But it highlights the ongoing synthesis. Sometimes, Bridging two worlds means standing in that awkward middle ground, singing an ancient tune while interpreting data on a spreadsheet. A fringe tidbit posted on a bulletin board captures your attention. Say snail telepathy. It reads, accompanied by a winking emoji. Apparently, a handful of local enthusiasts claim that on nights of a certain lunar phase, snails gather en masse in symmetrical patterns. The phenomenon has been dubbed the snail convergence. No one's provided conclusive video evidence, so it remains in the realm of legendable or modern internet rumor. But you can't resist picturing a midnight snorkeler shining a flashlight on a perfect spiral formation of snails, feeling like they've stumbled into a secret marine dance. Whether it's real or not, the story injects a little whimsy into the quest for truth. Moving on, you pass a row of glass cases displaying shells collected from different parts of the island, each labeled with the date and location. There's a note urging visitors to respect current regulations about shell collecting, remnants of those ancient taboos, or newly instated conservation rules. Either way, the message is clear: the snail population needs protection, and rampant souvenir hunting can be damaging. It's a practical echo of the old ways, which understood that over-harvesting, even the smallest creatures, could upset the ecological balance. Sometimes, tradition and modern conservation end up aligning in beautiful, if unexpected, ways. Stepping outside, you find a small courtyard where a group is gathered in a circle under a kukui tree. A woman in a simple, flowing dress plays a soft tune on a nose flute, while another person reads from what looks like a modern adaptation of an ancient chant. Their voices weave a gentle, rhythmic call, referencing snail shells as guardians of hidden knowledge. You stand at the edge, letting the melody wash over you in waves. The mix of present, day clothing and centuries-old verses gives the scene a timeless quality. It's as if the island is whispering these stories aren't gone, just waiting to be remembered. Still, despite the surge of interest, many questions remain unanswered. Did early Hawaiians systematically use snail behavior as a precise tool to track every season? Or did they lump snails in with broader observations of tides, clouds, and stars? Can modern biology confirm color changes or migrations that might predict weather shifts? Or were these details more poetic than literal, woven into chants primarily for spiritual or aesthetic reasons? Historians still argue whether snail lore served an essential function, or if it was just one thread among many in a rich tapestry of observational science. One researcher you overhear in the courtyard puts it neatly: we may never have a definitive record, but each new clue helps us piece together the puzzle. That sentiment resonates. Sometimes knowledge isn't about black and white answers, but about layering glimpses of understanding. A child listening to that researcher pipes up, "So we don't know for sure if snail shells can predict storms." And the researcher shrugs, replying, "Not yet." But testing it is half the fun, right? You can't help but grin at this interplay, which captures both the seriousness and playfulness of cultural revival. As you leave the courtyard, you notice a stack of pamphlets promoting a public talk called Shells of the Past, Seasons of the Future. It promises to explore how old Hawaiian practices might inform modern climate adaptation strategies. There's something poetic in that snail observations might help communities face rising sea levels and shifting weather patterns in the decades ahead. On your way out, you imagine a group of climate scientists huddled in a lab, scanning snail shell pigmentation for clues about ocean warming. A snail-based forecast for global warming? Why not? Stranger collaborations have happened. Energized by this fusion of tradition and innovation, you step away from the research station, heart buoyed by the knowledge that the story doesn't end with colonization or lost chance. People are piecing it back together, reconciling ancient ways with modern tools. The snails themselves remain quietly at work in their watery realms, oblivious to the controversies swirling around them. And maybe that's their gift, a reminder that nature just keeps doing its thing, waiting for us to pay attention. You leave the research station behind, stepping into a crisp morning that feels full of promise. Ahead, a narrow footpath winds between tall grasses and patches of rugged lava rock, leading you toward the coastline once more. The sky is awash with shifting pastel hues, pinks blending into oranges, mirroring the idea that Hawaii's cultural tapestry is continually being rewoven. You sense that your journey through centuries of snail lore is nearing its close, yet there's one more whisper of wisdom to uncover. As you follow the trail, you spot a solitary figure standing at the edge of a high cliff overlooking the sea. Drawn by curiosity, you approach quietly, mindful not to disturb the hush of dawn. The figure turns, revealing a gentle-faced Kupunas elder, hair silvered by the passing of many seasons. They offer a soft smile, as though they've been expecting you. Wordlessly, they gesture for you to join them in gazing out at the boundless ocean. Down below, waves crash against dark rocks, sending up bursts of white spray that glisten in the early light. This vantage point offers a sweeping view of the reefs that fringe the shoreline, reefs teeming with fish, coral, and, of course, sea snails. The kupuna begins to speak in a low, measured voice that resonates with the cliff's timeless presence. You lean in, catching phrases that tie together everything you've learned: how ancient Hawaiians once watched snail shells change color, how some believed they predicted storms, and how modern researchers are still trying to verify these tales. They mention a mainstream historical fact. After the unification of the islands under King Kamehameha I in the early 19th century, cultural practices could more easily spread between regions. This helped certain local beliefs, snail lore included, find broader exposure. Yet, ironically, that same era welcomed more Western ships, which accelerated social change. The kupuna chuckles at the irony, calling it the push and pull of history. That's your first light-hearted moment for this final stretch, the notion that unification brought both continuity and disruption. Historians still argue whether any official edict ever addressed snail observation. The kupuna notes. Some say there were mandates ensuring sustainability for marine life, while others believe snail lore was purely a grassroots tradition. That's the puzzle we leave for future generations. You feel the weight of that statement, the sense that history can be both well documented and perpetually elusive. The ocean below rumbles softly, as if agreeing that mysteries often remain half submerged, just out of reach. A fringe tidbit spills from the elder's lips, a story of a traveling priest who supposedly used a type of snail slime as a medicinal salve, chanting sacred verses over it to enhance its healing power. Did it actually work, or did belief make it so? The kupuna offers no certainty, merely a thoughtful shrug. You recall hearing modern healers talk about snail mucin in skincare. Maybe the ancient priest was ahead of the curve. You crack a smile at that parallel, your second comedic moment. The idea that the latest trendy serum might just be an echo of an old Hawaiian remedy. As the sun lifts higher, illuminating the waves in shimmering gold, the kupuna closes their eyes and begins a quiet chant. Their voice flows like water, describing how each wave has a beginning and an end, just as life's cycles do. The snail, they say, represents patience and continuity. Even if it's slow, it persists, and over countless generations, its shell spirals outward, marking time in a hidden language. The chant's rhythm taps into something deep in your chest, as though reminding you to breathe in the present moment. And all the history carried within it. You think back to the comedic jests about Snail, watching apprentices, the festival gatherings that used snail shells as offerings, and the missionaries who tried to stamp out pagan customs. You recall the fish ponds that thrived on the snail's algae, eating habits, the taboos that protected reefs, and the rumor of snail telepathy. Each piece of the puzzle rests in your memory now, forming a tapestry of how a small creature can shape, reflect, and hint at an entire culture's relationship with the land and sea. As if sensing your thoughts, the kupuna opens their eyes and points to a small cluster of tide pools far below. Even from up here, you can see tiny specks scattered across the rocks, snails basking in the warmth. Another comedic notion crosses your mind. Maybe they're hosting a morning meeting, discussing which tourist to baffle next. That's your third gentle laugh. The kupuna grins, as though reading your thoughts, and says, "They've always had their secrets, those snails. Perhaps one day we'll learn them all." With that, the elder turns and begins to walk away from the cliff's edge. You follow, descending a gently sloping path that leads you down to a calmer stretch of beach. The surf here is subdued, as though the ocean itself is easing into a reflective mood. You see footprints in the sand, some fresh, some blurred by the receding tide, reminders of how time erases all but the stories we choose to preserve. Down by the water, the kupuna stoops and lifts a small snail shell that has washed ashore. They hand it to you, their expression quiet and reverent. You study the shell's spiral, each ridge a marker of growth, each swirl hinting at cycles older than any chant. You run your thumb over its smooth surface, remembering the lively debates, the old chants, and the newly conducted research. A swirl of feelings tugs at you: admiration, wistfulness, curiosity, at how a boring topic like snail shells could turn out to be such a deep well of cultural resonance. In these final moments, the kupuna speaks softly. Whether snail shells truly guided our ancestors or merely accompanied them, they're part of the larger story. We inherit that story, incomplete though it may be. If you listen, the shells might yet whisper truths we've forgotten. The wind stirs their hair, carrying the words across the gentle waves. You sense the conversation drawing to a close, like a final chord in a melody that lingers long after the music ends. The kupuna offers a parting smile and moves on. You stand there, the snail shell cupped in your hand, waves lapping at your ankles. There's a hush in your mind, as though the entire island exhales around you. Slowly, you place the shell back at the water's edge, letting it settle among the polished stones. The ocean glides over it, as if welcoming the shell home. You watch, unhurried, until the shell is just a faint glimmer beneath the surface, merging with the continuity of sea and sand. As the morning sun climbs higher, you step away, feeling lighter yet deeply grounded. The shore behind you dissolves into memory. Each footstep in the sand is erased by the ocean's gentle sweep, but the stories of snail lore remain etched in your thoughts, alive and echoing. Boring history for sleep, indeed. It has carried you through myths, rituals, colonial upheavals, debates, and modern revival. You inhale the salt air, exhaling gratitude for the chance to glimpse a piece of Hawaii's soul through these tiny shells that once guided, or maybe just graced a proud and enduring people. You walk on, letting the hush of the island wrap itself around you, the lullaby of waves guiding you toward rest. But you carry those whispers, each swirl of snail shell knowledge, tucked safely in your heart, ready to resurface whenever you need a reminder of how the smallest things can bear the greatest significance in this ocean of life. Take one last, deep breath as you feel your body grow softer, your mind surrendering to the gentle pull of rest. Each inhale carries the fresh memory of moonlit beaches and drifting canoes, where snails once slithered across ancient reefs. Each exhale releases any lingering tension, allowing your thoughts to sink into a calm, comforting sea of twilight. Picture yourself on a tranquil shore at dusk, the sky awash in pastel glimmers. The ocean's hush cradles you from afar, each wave folding gently into the sand like a soothing lullaby. Overhead, stars prick the sky, their silver glow reflecting upon tidal pools where sea snails glide in slow, graceful arcs. Imagine their delicate shells shimmering under soft moonlight, each swirl an invitation to deeper serenity. Feel the air grow warmer around you, your senses drifting into a serene haze, like gently bobbing on calm waters. Allow your eyes to close if they haven't already, and welcome the soothing darkness behind your eyelids. In this quiet moment, let all thoughts float away, replaced by the soft echoes of distant chants and gentle waves. As you curl into your bed, let the weight of the day melt away, replaced by the comforting presence of an island night that has accompanied you through this story. With each measured breath, you draw closer to deep, restful sleep, sleep that invites the subtle wisdom of ancient Hawaiians, guided by the tender secrets of sea snails, to whisper in your dreams. Now, give in to that final exhale. Let your thoughts drift into the far horizon. Let the hush of the ocean cradle you, slow and steady. You are safe, you are warm, and all is well.